It's always super fun to present one of these. A few disclaimers first before we get lit. The cases and theories may vary by your prof, so make sure you check with your VP academic as to what is and isn't going to be covered on the exam. You can also talk to your prof, but I think there is a policy that you can't email them for a certain few hours or days before the exam to keep things fair. The second part is this meeting's being recorded. If you're staying, you're okay with that. And that's because there's some sections and students who do want to watch this asynchronously. I think there's a section or two at the Toyota plant today. Third, I'm not a TA for this course, and this is kind of for fun. It's for personal learning purposes. And the material is mostly from past years. But from my discussions with Section 7's VP Academic, it should be pretty similar, just one or two cases that are different. So today we'll be getting into four main chapters. We'll talk about how you should do well on the exam, which you have 4 hours to write, some of the main strategies that were covered throughout the rest of your cases, so like the theories and frameworks you can use. And then we'll talk to you about 10 key pieces of technology which you may want to bring up and which your case might be based on. I can't predict the future, but if you do know a bit of background about what they're asking you, it definitely does make things easier. And finally, if we do have some Q&A, I did this course last year. I'm an HBA too, so I may not know the cases all that well. You might want to check in with your own section and VP academic. So if you take a look at the syllabus, there's like 2 main modules that are covered within this midterm. The first one is how to derive value from IT, and that is a description of what are the basic ways in which technological capabilities have business impact and actually create value. So we'll think about the introductory courses, which cover a lot of these key concepts, Zara and Nasdaq. And then we'll jump to how do we actually use digital technology as a disruptive force? How do you compete against others, make your own markets, and perhaps make an industry completely different? What's interesting is LIT isn't that much of a course on how much you know about actual technologies. So don't worry, the people who did computer science don't have that much of an advantage, but it will be good for you to know some major trends and processes. So we will cover that a bit near the end. So exam strategy. You got 4 hours. I think it's normally from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., but sometimes they might do 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. And I think there are optional exhibits. You got to check with your section, but we were allowed to create diagrams and paste them in. So you can take a screenshot and then upload it, as well as write up your actual report with an Exemplify. So don't write it in Word, write it in Exemplify. I have some friends who copy pasted it over and that the word limit was different and the formatting was different. It just makes more sense to write it. Exemplify will also save your work if your computer crashes or something. We had a word limit of around 2,000, so be concise. It's more important to use full sentences to get your points out there, as opposed to just going on and on trying to think you can impress them with length. So here's like the suggested time distribution of how you should approach this case. I used this last year. I spent the first 30 minutes with a highlighter reading through the case, figuring out where we are right now, what technology systems they use, how's their business architecture, so like their model, their people, their processes looking, and what do they have to do? What's the main challenge? And then over the next 45 minutes, started doing my write-up on understanding their current state. So you can do like a little section about the business, like how do they currently make money, how do they stand against their competitors, and what's going right and wrong. And then when you meet like the junction at which they have to make a decision, you can start listing out what would I use to actually measure if they made the right decision. So are they about to go under and they need to rapidly increase revenue without taking on additional costs? Is it that they want to enter a new market and they need to see the total number of customers? And based on these KPIs, you can start writing out, like, it doesn't have to be quantitative, like, oh, we hit a number, we do it. We don't hit it, we don't do it. It can be qualitative, like if we're seeing good trends in, say, the growth in customers, perhaps it will be a good idea for us to adopt this new IT system, etc. On top of that, then you want to write out how should their business model change. So that's like the business strategy side. How do they make money? How do they serve customers? And then how do you reconfigure like the IT systems to match that? I think the most important takeaway from LIT's first half is you have to figure out how the strategy actually works for the business first, and then jump into how does that actually reflect on the IT systems. Finally, you can make one of those little Gantt charts or like like the waterfall looking implementation diagrams, or you can just write it out with a number list on Exemplify. Like, I don't think they really penalize you on how you present it. It's what you say. So you want to talk about project phases, like scoping things out, actually developing it, testing it, launching it to like a few users first, and then bring it out to everybody, and what setbacks they might face. So make sure you have risks and mitigations. And for the very last hour, I tend to just edit, build diagrams, try to make it cleaner, check if there's any major flaws in my logic, and get ready to submit. At the end of the day, the problems are never really that difficult. It's how well can you present yourself in 4 hours that will make you the difference between 82 and 85, for example. So to prep for this, I have this really annoying thing on OneDrive, and my friends have it under Google Drive, where if you save them files and you don't open it, it thinks that you aren't using the files and deletes them. And then we want to open the files again, it requires an internet connection to download it. So find a folder that isn't linked to OneDrive or Google Drive, like download or desktop on your computer, and save all of the files that you'll need, assuming it's open book. So you can use this presentation. Your section drives should have previous framework and strategy docs, which explain concepts and which have perhaps copy pastable blocks you can use, some cases or write-ups you've done in the past. And if you really want to go the extra mile, you can search up like Harvard Business Review or MIT Technology Review and grab some articles about like 2 or 3 of the hottest things that you're discussing in tech right now. And that might be helpful in terms of actual subject material to bring up. You can also bring some more business strategy articles as well. Kind of a joke, but sometimes I'm like, what does Ivey actually teach me? It teaches me to learn things during the exam, so that might not hurt. Okay, so brief pause before we get into the actual business like theories and frameworks. Do we have any questions? I don't think my Zoom has a chat feature, so you might have to unmute. Okay, silence is golden, so I'll move on, but you can interrupt me if you have any questions. The number one concept that LIT touches on is disruptive strategy. And disruption is kind of this term with a lot of very broad definitions. You might see it being used in the news as in to say, oh, there's a new disruptor on the market, or this technology is very disruptive. But when we're thinking about it in terms of this course, we have to use what is kind of an official textbook definition of disruption. And we use the definition given by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. And I'll read off the entire thing to you, and then I'll explain what it means in a simplified way. So disruption constitutes an innovation which allows a whole new population of consumers at the bottom of a market. So that means they couldn't do things related to what this innovation provides before, new access to like the stated product or service that was kind of like gate kept for people who used to have a lot of money or a lot of skill. So one way we can think of this is there's a new guy, a new entrant, who comes in from below, as in serving this previously underserved or untapped market segment. And it offers like perhaps similar or even inferior services, but at a much more accessible price point so that more people can participate and actually compete in this market. Typically, when a disruptive innovation presents itself, the incumbents, which is what we call those who are already playing inside the market, aren't too scared of it because they think, oh, this disruptive innovation is targeting a segment which is not that lucrative. Like, it's the people at the bottom of the totem pole. They aren't big spenders. They aren't going to give us very large custom orders. We don't make much money from them anyways. We're actually happy to give up this lower segment so that, this new player can come take it in because we can focus on more lucrative, more profitable segments. And that's all fine and dandy until the disruptor, because they have a much better cost structure, that is, they can service like who you previously serviced with a lower price that they incur, right? Lower cost that they incur. They eventually start moving up market. So they serve more and more premium segments until eventually you as like the main player discover, holy crap, there's this new player that can do what I do, but better and cheaper. And then you're kind of screwed. So one example is cell phones and cell towers. So if you think of the traditional like wireline telephones, like everyone had probably used like a Bell payphone if you were born like 2003, 2004, right? And over time, it just became less and less popular because initially, like cell phones were meant to serve a very, very small market. Um, it was only those who were able to access it based on like the high price. However, over time, as they were able to improve their cost structure and uh, bring things to much larger markets, fixed line telephony just couldn't compete because you had to spend more and more money on laying lines to places of work, places of residence, as opposed to a cell tower, which could just have much broader coverage. So if you get asked a question like, is this disruptive? You should probably consider, is it Christensen's definition, or is it like a more generic disruptive description like I just gave? So there's a few other types of disruption that you should know about. For example, classic disruption, which is Christensen's theory. And then you also have platform disruption, which is where you have an industry kind of turn on its head because you're able to better link people, places, and products. Think about Uber, which very much coordinates the process between matching taxi drivers and riders, or Airbnb with people who have spare homes, or I guess now like rental units and people who do want to rent. You also have architectural disruption, which comes up when you not only apply new technology, but a new type of business model. So if you're not that familiar with cloud computing, it gives you an option to like run your apps or like make your servers work without having to buy and install like a big physical computer in like your company's basement. Instead, it all just runs over the internet and you could rent like a little bit at a time. And you're charged based on how much you consume, not, well, the cost of purchasing and setting up a whole server. And since that's like whole new tech, like wholly new tech, which is you can rent and use computers over the internet, and a business model, which is charging people for IT services based on how much they use versus setting up in the first place, that's architectural. So speaking of Uber, if you look at their original pitch deck, which is probably one of the not great looking but super great content ones of all time, you can see how they described the cab industry before it was disrupted in 2008. You would probably have to call into a central like command center, like there'll be this like 7-digit number you could call from your phone, and then kind of like 911, like a radio dispatcher would say, okay, where do you want to be picked up? Where do you want to go? And they use a radio to communicate to a guy in an actual taxi cab who would then drive to your place, pick you up, use the meter, and drop you off. So that's the phone way. Or if you live in a dense city like New York, I guess you could flag them down. And that sucks for drivers because they have to spend a lot of time looking for riders. And it kind of sucks for riders because you don't know where your cab is, you don't know when it's coming, and you don't know how much it'll cost. Now, Uber Cab, I guess they changed their name to Uber and dropped the cab part, is meant to just use, I think it was either text messaging or a very lightweight mobile and web application to coordinate you together. I don't really have to explain Uber to you. I assume you've used it before. But because you cut out the middleman of the taxi company, you're able to allow a lot more people to play. And you can offer the same service for cheaper and with potentially even better features because you know where the taxi cab is and you know where your next job is, depending on whether you're the rider or the driver, respectively. So classic disruption is kind of a pretty big threat to these main players or incumbents. And that's because they get very complacent. When you're doing well, you're growing bigger, it's very easy to fall into the trap of just incrementally improving your product without thinking about, is there a better, like totally new way that we could do things? And so there's kind of like three preferences for these big companies. The first one is to embrace self-disruption, where within their own business, they are able to spin off like a different unit, like they have an R&D department that just predicts what the next disruption is going to be. And they use their better market position, more resources, like they have money saved up on their balance sheet, for example, call it like a balance sheet fortress. And they can just take advantage of their stronger engineering talent to build the thing and prevent competitors from taking and eating their cake. So that's option number one here. And the reason why we have to build these projects as separate units, which are like politically protected, like they're their own department, they don't have to face the same financial constraints or key performance indicators as the rest of the business, is because if they're subject to like the current politics and the current requirements, they're not going to be able to potentially come up with a product that might fight or cannibalize what they're already doing. It's kind of a factor of life within like innovation and disruption, that you will start making less and less money on each customer served over time. But if you can vastly increase, for example, the number of customers served through classic disruption, that might still result in more revenue and profit overall. So obviously, people within the same business don't like when someone else comes and steals the thunder or develops a better product or hurts their business unit. So you have to protect them. Um, this is typically a department called Skunk Works, or at least I think it is for some like airline or aerospace manufacturing companies. The alternative is you can try to reinvent the way your entire business creates new products. So a bank, TD in Toronto, launched something they called the next evolution of work, in which they made everybody manage their projects differently. So they grouped people from all sorts of business departments together. And those teams would focus just on creating one new product, as opposed to having a different finance, IT, HR sector. And the idea was that through changing the way they operated, they had effectively changed their ability to create these new products. So the number one preference for these large companies, try to disrupt yourself. The second thing is, it's not on a slide, but if you can't beat them, buy them. So a lot of these companies, which perhaps saw some threats, for example, Power Corporation, they deal with financial services. They were seeing some threats from like upstarts, such as Wealthsimple, which offered like a much more fintech personalized way to manage your innovations and to like launch new products and to serve like customers like millennials. And in that case, Power Corporation ended up giving a whole lot of money and buying like a pretty major stake in Wealthsimple so that they wouldn't be like direct competitors, or so that they could actually use the technology to their own benefit. So some other things companies can do, they want to stop thinking about, you know, what is one additional feature we could add, or what is like an easy way for us to achieve like a new technical win on a product, and more so start considering what jobs are our customers actually doing by using our products. And that's super important, because if you aren't targeting their actual pain point, it doesn't matter how great you think your next innovation is, it's not going to land well with your customers. And once you figure out what jobs they're doing, segment them. What are the different jobs? And then find the lowest cost way that ticks that box without charging them anything extra. And you'll see like rapid growth for your product. So if we think of like a company that's self-disrupted itself multiple times, it's Netflix. So the first one was classical disruption. Of course, renting DVDs in store is expensive because you have to cover costs such as the overhead of operating the store, staff salaries, delivery, and like inventory management. Netflix actually was originally a DVD by mail service, where on a website you could say, I want to watch the new Lion King, for example. And internet connections were really slow at the time, so you couldn't stream it unless you wanted to wait 16 hours for it to download. And they would actually just mail you a DVD that you'd stick in your computer, watch it however many times you wanted. And then they give you a return label so you could return the DVD once you were done. If you remember Blockbuster back in the day, you had to go to the machine outside the store or go in store, pick out the DVD, sign it out with the clerk, pay the money, return the DVD, or get a fine, right? So they were able to reach a much bigger market than Blockbuster, because anyone with a mailing address in the States could use Netflix. And it was right to the doorstep, as opposed to you having to go out for like 10-kilometer drive. Next, when streaming became a thing, Netflix didn't choose to bury their head in the sand. They said, let's embrace streaming, even though it will totally muck up our DVD model, and it'll perhaps result in lower profits for a bit. We need to figure out how to be the number one streaming company so we can get people to watch shows, watch movies. And so they adopted that effectively, unlike Blockbuster, who just never really embraced streaming till it was too late. And then after Blockbuster had died, Netflix started competing with like some new streaming services like Prime Video, Hulu, and they decided to once again disrupt themselves with platforms by not just having viewers, but having like producers, the film studios who actually made the movies come on board as part of Netflix. So they made originals. They made exclusive release to Netflix movies. All right, network effects. So we've all used social networks, social media. This should be pretty intuitive. The idea is that as a network gets bigger, so say as more people join LinkedIn or Instagram, everybody who's currently using the network gains some benefit because it's yet another person you can reach. It's someone you can get to know, a potential business connection. And then the second idea, key to networks, is that when one person starts doing better, it actually benefits the whole network. So you can think of LinkedIn and first, second, and third degree connections, for example. If one person gets really good at posting content about a specific topic, say like AI or something, and a lot of people follow them, then this content, because it's good, it gets pushed out to a lot more people because as more and more people like the content, it kind of snowballs into making it show up on more people's feeds. So as a network grows, its entire value for both individuals and the like group of people as a whole grows even more. It's like a feedback loop. You can think of Uber once again. So more Uber customers means greater demand. So Uber drivers earn more. So there's more Uber drivers. And if there's more Uber drivers, then you're more likely to get a ride quicker. So there's more Uber customers. And of course, Uber makes more money based on the transactions, and its shareholders or stakeholders derive some financial benefit from that as well. So if you look at the growth patterns belonging to old school like traditional businesses versus platforms, what do you see? Well, for old school, it's what we call an S curve. So the growth is pretty fast at first, but then if you remember calc, I did terrible in calc, but the slope gets a little less sharp and then it becomes flatter. These are called diminishing returns until it kind of like maxes out and gets very comfortable within a particular market. But the idea with platforms is that as it continuously snowballs, the growth is exponential. So it doesn't actually slow down. The main difference in which you can tell between like old school businesses and platforms is that old school businesses tend to be very production based. So like they're transforming physical materials into like an actual product or service. Then they're going to sell that. And then as they continually sell more, like demand tends to fall off. So if I'm like producing shovels for like a village in Ethiopia, as soon as everybody starts having one shovel, maybe they'll benefit from two shovels. But will you really convince them to buy a third shovel? No, you kind of saturated that market, right? And these old school businesses make money by like doing all of the production and distribution themselves. But what's cool about platforms, which you think about as like eBay or Amazon, like their seller marketplaces, is that you make money whenever someone else does something. And you don't really have to be hands-on besides making sure the platform itself works. Because you are making that transaction happen. It's the same thing with like credit card payments. If you think of Visa or MasterCard, for example, whenever a transaction occurs, you take a little bit of it. And as more and more transactions occur, it snowballs, right? People begin to gain trust in your platform. More people come to your platform for more things. And so theoretically, I guess there is like a cap. Like if all of humanity uses it, maybe it won't grow that much faster. But you could argue you can increase demand. Platforms are just very, very lucrative in terms of the returns. That's because the constraint is gone of you having to, broker things one at a time. You're creating a platform for exchange. Platform disruption occurs when you have businesses that link together a couple different players to create value. So Google perhaps will show some ads to users and make sure that the advertisers get eyes seen on their product. Because they facilitate these exchanges, as I previously stated, they don't have to do anything beyond making sure the base infrastructure works. And it's these connections, these transactions that derive the most amount of value. We'll talk about how these platforms compete with one another in a bit, but we just want to tie back together the two main concepts previously, network effects and platforms. We can call network effects, or kind of like these, I think some people might like to use flywheel as a term, or like feedback loop. We can turn them to be same side or different side. And same side is what occurs when it only affects one player, but it like snowballs in a particular direction. So if you have more Uber drivers, to a certain extent, what ends up happening is you get more efficient routing because people can cover specific segments or areas that they're more familiar with. And because your routes become, like more lucrative, there are actually more joggers that do want to join. This is especially pertinent if you institute like a driver referral program, or if you get a friend to join, you make 250 bucks on the spot. A different side network effect is when a change on one side affects another side, and which can ultimately bring it back. So as with the previous example, more drivers means more riders, means more drivers, based on the fares being optimized, better service patterns, more demand. So how do platforms fight one another? Um, this was like headlines a few years ago, but we've all heard of Expedia or like a similar platform like Trivago, the main hotel Trivago. And Trivago or Expedia specializes just in matching users with hotels when they want to find a place to stay. Whereas Google is kind of like a universal search engine, right? Like Google has so many search platforms. They can search through your mail, they can search through the images, the websites, all the places on earth with maps, news articles, shopping sites, but they didn't have flights. And so Expedia and Trivago were having a really brilliant time making a lot of money because Google didn't have this functionality. But when Google launched their Google Flight search engine, Expedia's stocks tanked. And what actually ended up happening was their users tanked too. So you might be thinking, why would this happen? I'm sure Expedia was like a specialist engine that a lot of people would have preferred because they've been doing it for longer, they have better functionality. It's because people are really tied down to an ecosystem. It's hard to get people to change or like move away from their homes, so to speak. And the funniest thing is like the envelop means to like wrap around. In this case, doesn't actually need to have a better product. Just because of the stickiness, so to speak, of their overall ecosystem, they can target the vast majority of users who aren't going to take advantage of all of the fully fledged features that Expedia has. Like maybe 10 to 20% of Expedia's users will be considered power users who need all of the brilliant features. But for the average Joe who just wants to see what's the average cost of a flight from Toronto to Ottawa or Montreal, Google is so easy that instead of clicking 2 times within the search results into Expedia and then typing it again, Google just brings up the results straight up. And then Google can broker the deal instead, and Expedia doesn't make as much money or have that many users. So the attacker's product need not be superior. It can be similar, good enough, grab the vast majority. So this is like platform disruption, right? So obviously the user base needs to overlap so this can happen. And then the attacker needs to offer more and more features as opposed to Expedia. Expedia doesn't have a generic search engine. Google does. Google has an email platform, image search. And so if we think of the 5 rules that you can use to have businesses grow and win when competing digitally, the number 1 rule is that platforms who can take advantage of network effects the most and really become that strongest platform that benefits all sides as much as possible tend to win. They tend to get ahead of their rivals. And this is why Google is kind of like your everything platform, right? You can have like a Google Nexus phone. You could do all of your searching, emailing, productivity. You don't need Microsoft Word, you got Google Docs, right? And since you're so locked into the ecosystem, Google, as it is big, just tends to get bigger. The second part is that platforms don't compete based on niche functionality. It's on having more features that are convenient to you. And the official term for this is multi-homing. Or I guess that's the term for what happens when you actually maintain presences across different platforms. Single homing would be the right term for using Google for everything. We also call this a vendor lock-in. A vendor is like a particular provider of like software, and lock-in is you being stuck. So good example is why would you drink Coke and Pepsi when you just buy Coke in bulk? And I guess there are some people who want to use MacBooks because they have iPhones. There are some people, like when we ran this session in person, I would ask who uses Apple everything. And we have a half to 2/3 of the class raising their hands. The reason why people don't want to switch is because there's like a disadvantage to it. These are termed switching costs. So for example, if you do move from iPhone to Mac, but then you switch from iPhone to like a Windows computer, you'll lose a lot of great features, like the ability to respond to iMessages and text messages on your computer, not having FaceTime on your computer. And all of this comes together to indicate that in this market, those who can build out better platforms, which have all of the features, tend to take all. If you look at some markets which aren't Canada or the US, like say Africa or Asia, Google is kind of the winner take all there because of like differences in purchasing power parity and because it just offers so many features. Whereas here we're used to like, I guess the more elegant design experience of like Apple products. So it has a stronger hold on like your earbuds, your watch if you have one, your phone, your laptop, tablet, etc. Three more quick rules. So because platforms are just growing larger and larger, you have companies which try to do everything. Is this always a good strategy? Not necessarily. There are many like, specialist companies which just excel by not playing with other platforms. But as you can see from the main tech companies, this is what tends to happen. And then you also have companies which tend to enter more and more sectors because they have these platform advantages. So Amazon started off as a bookstore. They moved into selling like retail items. And then because their retail items had such a massive increase in demand over Christmas time, Black Friday, they had to build a lot of computing infrastructure so that they could handle like 10 million visitors on one Boxing Day morning. They had a lot of spare computer space, so then they started selling that for cloud computing, Amazon Web Services. So there's a lot of synergies or like benefits, ease of expansion for these large companies. Finally, it's the trend that consumers are paying less and less or even using products for free. TikTok is a great example because the consumer ends up being the product. TikTok is very, very valuable because it has a very, very good matching algorithm that figures out based on how long you dwell on each video, whether you like it, whether you swipe up and back, what your actual interests are. It's like the least intrusive but most intrusive way of figuring out details about you to sell to advertisers as possible. Because you're never really filling out a form saying, I'm interested in this. No, I don't think that is like up my alley. But based on what you choose to consume, all of this data means that when you see an ad, you're more likely to engage with it. Hence, that's how they make their money. So if it's free, you're probably the product. A few more slides, almost done. Architectural disruption, you have to think back to LPO for this one. It's that you cannot simply implement a new technology without making sure that people, processes, and the rest of your business configuration actually match it. And the reason why this is because the actual configuration for business dictates the vast majority of like the costs, how you're actually able to innovate based on like development speed. And we have many case studies of launching a new technology, but ultimately failing. When Blockbuster tried breaking into streaming, its business model was already so messed up that it simply could not compete with Netflix. If they had pivoted maybe 2 to 3 years before they had, and when Netflix was just starting off to move from DVDs into streaming, had they completely reorganized like their business departments, laid off some people who were only focused on dealing with VCRs and DVDs, hired new engineers, created a new business unit which was just innovating on streaming, they might have been able to actually take advantage of this technology. But by the time they tried it, it was too little too late. Okay, when you're developing a new product that you want to be disruptive, you use this iterative process where you kind of build like a version that works okay for now. This is called like a minimum viable product. And then you test it thoroughly by actually bringing it to customers, seeing how much they engage with it, pay for it, what their feedback is based on what they do, not just what they say. And at the end of the day, you incrementally deliver a better update, a better product, a better feature. For example, with iOS, like your phone operating system or Android, it's always iterative. They don't just build one operating system over the course of 4 years and say, this is perfect. You're never going to need to change this ever again. Every 2 months or every year or so, you get new features based on how they continually iterate on it. If you're building a house, this is a very sequential process, right? Like once you pour the concrete, once you make the foundation, once you construct the frame and add in drywall, you're probably not going to remodel it unless you want to knock the whole thing down and do like a complete reno. And that's why these companies that use iterative processes are able to achieve disruption. They're always looking at what's happening on the market, what do customers actually want, as opposed to, hey, we have this one read which we think will be perfect. Of course not. I don't know if this is covered in your course material, so I'll just quickly breeze through it. Um, there's like five factors uh, dictated by Rogers, but which we'll call the diffusion of innovation theory. Um, I think the buzz phrase I like to use is crossing the chasm. So you have different segments of users when faced, who will react differently when faced with a new technology. You have those who will just play with it even when it's not ready, like innovators. Those who see some inklings of potential when it starts being used more and more mainstream, called early adopters. Um, and then those who actually start using it en masse, called the early majority. And to actually cross over from not just having early adopters use your technology because they're very open to risk, open to try new things, but people who rely upon your technology for day-to-day operations, as in the early majority, um, that's a challenge. You have to achieve this thing called product market fit, where your product is actually good enough, it meets the expectations and delivers on what the vast majority of people prefer. And then it's just a matter of time until they start using it. Um, I don't know if this will be a major part of the exam, but during the implementation plan, it could be very smart to bring up, as we do innovate with like a new technology or roll it out, we need to use a lot of iterative processes to make sure we can cross the chasm. I think they'll like to hear that. So yeah, more or less same things. Um, how would you actually do this? Some more implementation plan stuff or strategy if you do want to talk about it. Um, it's kind of like D-Day, if you like history or military history. You have to establish like a beachhead or landing zone, like scope out a segment, what you think will actually be able to go full in, all in, um, adopting and using your product. It doesn't have to be a big segment. It just has to be a well-defined segment. And you want to like completely dominate that segment. Like you want that segment to be big enough to matter, but small enough for you to actually manage. And then you want to meet their needs so well that they wouldn't want to choose using anything else. So one good example is Apple. Apple launched their first computer called the Macintosh back in like 1983 or so, and they targeted like people who worked with visual arts who wanted to get into the digital stuff. Uh, the hello, that's so fancy that shows up. They wanted to target like artistics, um, people who were into graphic design. And through that process, Apple was one of the first to innovate. They were the first one to have like a desktop, like a mouse, a cursor that moves around that you can do like paint like things with. Microsoft was maybe 8 or 9 years away from developing that. And after they established that foothold, they started going to more and more creatives, people who did writing rather than drawing, for example. And then afterwards, a broader segment of people who just appreciated like technology design that looks very elegant and just works. Anyone who's used like a Microsoft product like Windows will probably breathe out a sigh of exasperation, go, oh, it doesn't work. But most Apple users are pretty happy with the fact that their product is simple and it just works. So they dominated that segment, they picked the segment, and then they moved outwards to other segments. That's how Apple crossed the chasm from just early adopters, people who like graphic design, to the early majority of people who just like technology that's easier to use. Okay, some of the frameworks. I think they really like alliteration because we see a lot of O's, S's, and P's repeated here. But it's very, very good thinking to bring this up during your exam. You can talk about how, like, you might even want to structure your exam into a segment where you talk about like where the business is right now and then how they should get from where they are right now to where they want to be. And you can break it down into strategy, structure, and system. Um, I would probably start off by answering with strategy because it's like very much defining your goals and what like targets you have to hit before moving to structure, which is like that business model, which has to ultimately support the technology. As we remember from the previous slides, if the tech is there, but the whole business's configuration isn't, it's probably going to fail, right? And then finally, you jump to system. Um, how does all of the options available to us, whether presented in case or with modifications that I propose, actually align well with first the model and then the overall strategy? They will definitely test you on this too, like the IT strategy grid. Depending on where the business is, they'll fall into one of the four categories, which I'll try to put in like very generic terms. But first to categorize and like understand what movement on the grid represents. If you're moving up on the grid, like increasing the operational dependence on IT, it's your business having more and more IT systems that affect its day-to-day operations. So for example, if you are in the 1970s or 1980s and you're starting to move from like old cash registers, which would use typewriter systems to print out things and have like receipts that you have to manually reconcile, to like a digital cash register or point of sale system that records everything in a central database so you can do accounting, taxes faster, you'll be increasing your operational dependence on IT. Another example in more modern times is if you manage a warehouse and you have to make sure you ship out customers' items within a day. To meet that goal, you might have to implement like a robotic system, which then helps you search through or like retrieve the items so that you can put them in shipping boxes, like what Amazon does right now. It's actually a super cool system. I think they're called Kiva robots. For you to operate as a business with that model, it's again more operationally important for you to use IT. But what does moving right mean then? It's a little less about operations or implementation, and it's more about strategy. It's, can my business survive from like how we actually make money and sell things and present ourselves as a brand using IT? So if you were, let's think about this, Walmart 20 years ago, IT was not strategically important to you. Everyone just drove to their local Walmart, purchased things there, and then put everything in the big shopping cart, loaded it in the car, and drove home. But today, people more and more expect convenience, like the ability to dictate, I want this immediately, I want it shipped to my house on the same day, and I want to pay for it through a website or on my phone. Because we're moving into like e-commerce as opposed to like physical storefronts, you're going to lose out on sales and you won't be able to operate as like a grocery business without like a working IT system. So that would increase your strategic importance of IT. If you're in the bottom left quadrant, so you don't really need IT to operate because you've got humans and it's not strategically important because people probably buy things in store, you're like Dollarama. It doesn't really matter as long as your cash register counts cash and records a sale. It's not really worth all of the additional value add because you're trying to play the strategy of price differentiation. If you are like a not so modern car manufacturer like Ford, like you don't pride technology as one of like your main innovations, but just like a car that works decently fine, you're in like factory mode. If your IT systems break down, you can't make cars and sell them, but you don't need an IT system to convince people to buy your cars. It's after they buy the cars that you need to use like your coordination software, project management, defect detection algorithms, whatever, to pull out the bad cars and replace the cars with good ones. If it's turnaround, it's like IT is really, really important for you, but you're doing it terribly. And that's probably where the vast majority of your cases and what your exam will probably be on. Can't predict the future, but typically they'll present a situation where you need to figure out how to strategically make better use of IT. So move from like the middle of like turnaround section here to like the right side, and then how to actually implement a system so that you are doing it well. So if you're like Wayfair or Wish or Temu, I guess that's a new one of the past year, and you rely on technology to find customers, make the sale, and then deliver it, you are probably using IT very strategically. Or if you're actually a tech company like Amazon, like web services, Microsoft, Google, of course, if your IT doesn't work, people aren't going to come and you can't make money. Okay, there's our happy ending. So what happened in that case, which is pretty much the introduction to the IT strategy grid? They're using computers from like the late 80s, and they're very, very bad at tracking sales. Like they don't talk well to one another, and you have to install updates. You guys know the save icon on like your computer and how it's like this weird rectangular shape? That's a floppy disk. Came before CDs. You had to shove it in the computer and move like 6 or 10 of them in and out just to get data around your systems. There was no like networking, so to speak. And so because there were more and more storefronts that were offering sales through other channels, or which allowed customers to improve the sales experience by using like a feature or system dependent on high tech, they moved into like a turnaround stage where IT became more and more important for them to actually make the sale and have it happen. But they were bottlenecked by their very poor IT systems. And so you had to come up with a strategy to better use IT to bring them into the strategic category. This is a buzzword that you'll probably want to remember: digital transformation and digital nativeness, being a digital native, which is where you start making sales and you operate your business not just with like fluency and good usage of technology, but with that as the starting base. So Zari pulled this off, not in the time frame of the case, but afterwards. They launched like a very on-brand site. They changed out all of their like point of sale systems, uh, customer relation management, enterprise resource planning systems, very modern ones. And that's how they were able to create this online sales system, which nowadays constitutes 1/4 of like their entire revenue. So many people buy into fast fashion to the point where you can just shop for it online as opposed to trying out in store. Okay, now for the little um, the section that's a little more nerdy or focused on actual tech components. Um, I don't think they'll penalize you if you don't know these, but it might be helpful to put your case into context. Before we move on, do we have any questions?
Yeah, hey Raymond, actually did have a question, but this is about something way earlier. It was in the beginning of the session when we were
Yep.
talking about the disruptiveness. You had mentioned that we could get a question saying like if this technology or if this business model is disruptive, and that we should analyze it for one of the three, which is like classic, architectural, or platform. And then you had also mentioned something that was like general disruption. Would that constitute us answering no to is this disruptive if it doesn't
Yeah,
fit into one of the three?
that's a great question. So when answering the question of is this disruptive, not sure if you guys will get it, not sure if we got it. I'm so academically honest, guys. I can't tell you anything about that. Um, you want to respond in a few parts. So you can take a look at each of these types of disruption as kind of like a template, yes or no. If they ask in the question, is this an example of platform or architectural disruption? Answer very targeted to that particular definition first. And then you can add in like a few extra sentences on, yeah, while it may not be considered platform disruption, in the more general sense of disruption, like how we use it to describe technology or classic or architectural, it very may well be the case. If it's like a very general question, like, is this disruptive? You can say disruption has many definitions, right? According to Christensen's classic definition of disruption, yes, because it entered from the market from below. If um, they're like disruptive, as in they're launching a new platform, but they're targeting people from higher markets who have a higher willingness to pay. For example, my example about Bell and then wireless telephoning, right? That would not be classic disruption because cell phones used to be way more expensive and only the richest like execs who drove their cars down to the office from like, I don't know, outside the GTA would have a cell phone so they could have their calls. That's not classic Christensen disruption because you're coming from above, not below. But as the pricing gets more and more affordable, um, you're able to actually take advantage of, say, platform disruption because you have more and more people who are making calls to one another on cell phones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. So if it's like more general and they don't pinpoint one of the types of disruption that they want us to analyze, we kind of just go through and see which one applies to the situation.
Exactly, because it's like a buzzword
Okay.
that you got to disambiguate, right?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Any other cues, friends? Okay, wonderful. Um, I'll try to make this quick and not technical, so we all know what these are about. Cloud computing, I explained it briefly, but back in the day, if you wanted to launch like a new app or service, you had to set up a whole big computer in your basement. You need to pay for a very expensive internet plan so that people could like access your resources quickly. And businesses would drop like 10, 15, 20 grand on like a whole big server, um, which is like a large computer which can handle a lot of requests and process a lot of data at once. So IT used to be considered a capital expenditure. Uh, Maybe throwback to FinFund or 2257, but that's like something you buy up front and you like kind of amortize or depreciate over time. Uh, and of course, that's a pretty big barrier to entry for innovation, right? Because if you don't have 20K lying around, say you build a really great app that just runs on your laptop, but you want to get it available to a big audience of people, you're not going to be able to serve that audience with your server. Until big companies like Amazon first and then Google, Microsoft, DigitalOcean, some of these other players started just building these really big data centers that had the capability to allow you to rent out like smaller racks, smaller servers, or even like a partial component of one to host your app so that you can get www.mywebsite.ca up and running without all that expensive equipment yourself. And based on how much you used uh, these resources over time, so like how many people visited your site, did you send them a lot of downloads? Is your application really big, so you need a lot of storage? Um, they would charge you just, costs and then a little premium. And they would manage setting up the infrastructure, setting up the equipment, making sure your app ran great. So this would greatly reduce your costs by like orders of magnitude. And when you're starting off, like they like to give you free credits nowadays, but all you have to do is pay your monthly bill. It's like instead of paying a monthly bill for internet, you're paying a monthly bill for a computer that just perfectly matches your needs. And thus it goes from a capital expenditure, we buy a lot of stuff at once, into an operating expense, right? It's like a line item on your income statement as opposed to like a very big purchase. The reason why cloud computing is so good for disruption is because it allows more and more people to develop applications like cheaply, with good performance, and for a low startup cost. Okay, Internet of Things. You connect everything to the internet, sensors, fridge, your dog, yourself, your running shoes, the lights in your house. The goal is to use a lot of like sensors and switches, for example, that talk to like an internet connected hub like Google Home, Apple Home, Amazon Alexa. That's like a consumer grade implementation, or like industrially, like we can now track the location of buses on Google Maps and transit based on like a sensor which pings their location every 30 seconds. The goal is to just collect as much data real time as possible. And in doing so, you're able to just give people a lot better information and insights on what's happening in the world around them. Generative AI, you should come to our talk tonight. I'll promote that after, but it's very much transforming like a question or like a raw data source into an output that you dictate in what form you want. If your business is considering, should we implement Gen AI? Remember, it's not really there to make decisions. It's not really there to replace workers. You won't be replaced by Gen AI. You'll be replaced by someone who's working faster because of it. So you can use it to like draft text, make images, make videos. I'm sure you guys know how to use it. AR, VR, XR, there's so many realities now, but augmented reality is like if you put on a headset and you see like the real world around you with like things popping up. Virtual reality is like if you're I don't know, put on the VR headset and playing Roblox or something, that's like a totally different reality. Or in the metaverse, extended reality where you put on glasses, and then I don't know how different this is from augmented reality, but you see stuff projected on walls, for example. The goal is that not just for consumers, doesn't make life a little cooler, but for companies, it's super, super important. If you're manufacturing, I'm sure Ops Prof will talk about this, but they can make these advanced models called digital twins, which effectively like replicate all of the production, like bottlenecks, capacity constraints, like it models all that out for you so that you're capable of doing some case-by-case analysis. What if we changed the production order to be this, 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 instead of that, that, that? Would it be faster? Blockchain is hard to understand. We can basically think of it as people owning objects and then trading those objects with each other in a way that everyone else can see the trades occurring. Don't worry too much about the specifics, but if you're talking about financial services, digital currencies, banking, brokering trade deals, it can be a good way to make things more visible and more affordable. Two types of developing products. This is very similar to iterative and waterfall, as I previously described. Are you going to deliver small feature improvements at a time? Or are you going to go all out and build a house and just call it a day once the house is done? This is more like the business mindset and the business model part, like structuring your people so they can actually accomplish like pushing out changes, like complete product versions one at a time versus just building the house, so to speak. If you have a product mindset and teams that have people from all sorts of different departments that stay together and continuously work on improving like iOS or the iPhone, that's like a product mindset. But you have people who come together just to finish one project, like a short-term time box thing. Like I'm going to make a website for my upcoming TED Talk. And then afterwards, everybody help build a website. It's going to go off back to their departments and do something different. That's kind of like your project mindset. Data management, dealing with data. There's this process called extract, transform, load, or extract, load, transform. This is when a business needs to make sure that the data is high quality and ready to use for like modeling with AI, for people to view, for people to make charts out of. Extract is where you just save everything to like a central repository, either like a database, a spreadsheet, whatever may you. Transform, which is where you clean it up. So if there's like bad values, you can cross those out. If there's empty values, you can replace them with 0, etc. And then load is which is where you put it in like a format that people are ready to use. So you save like your Excel file and share it to Google Drive. Then everyone's able to access that Google Sheet and then build graphs off of it. A risk mitigation you can always pull out is cybersecurity. You want to make sure that we have good access control. You want to make sure passwords and stuff aren't leaked. It's both like a technology-based thing so that, you know, if you're using good encryption, people can't just see data that's being sent between two systems, but it's also good process thing. So making sure people reset their passwords, putting in a system like Duo, we all hate it, but it's actually helpful for reducing hacks. They enter the password and they have to check off, I'm actually here, I have my device with me. So some mitigations and risks for you. And finally, the overall software development lifecycle, very important for implementation plan. You gotta have a section of time where you plan out what gets done, how do you want to do it, actually doing it and testing that it was done well, and then pushing it out to users and collecting their feedback. So that should be it for now. I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards up until 2:30. And section 7, you got a friend, Kelly. We are actually doing a talk tonight at the Morissette Entrepreneurship Building about how to better use generative AI in business entrepreneurship. Tickets are still available. There's free food. There's an amazing guest speaker who does venture capital investment in this area. So if you're interested in that, and then we'll teach you on a case we actually wrote. So please do come out, or if not, hope you enjoy the session. Happy to take questions and answers.
Sorry, could you just go back on the slide of like where it says blockchain?
Mhm.
Thank you.
I'll try to get this deck and a recording of this video out to your VP Academics group chat, and hopefully they can share it with the sections.